My name is Clara. Right now, all I hear is the wind sweeping across the Montana snow. I stand alone on the ranch my father left me, holding a rusted, broken branding iron. The silence here is absolute, a sharp contrast to the brutal storm that just tore my family apart. I remember that final day in court. I walked in perfectly calm, nothing like the terrified orphan they tried to break. To secure this peace, I had to completely destroy the very people who share my blood. I remember walking into the great room of the main house on the day of the reading. The stone fireplace was completely cold. I stood quietly in the corner, wearing the same frayed wool sweater I always wore to work the stables. Across from me sat Victoria, my half-sister. She had a heavy, expensive fur coat draped over her shoulders, looking like she owned the very air we were breathing. Next to her was her husband, Julian, tapping his fingers against his knee with a sly, calculating look. Wyatt and Mason, my two nephews, were already whispering and laughing by the window, completely unbothered by the fact that our father had just passed. A lawyer I had never seen before stood at the head of the long oak table, but he didn't read a will. Instead, Julian stood up and presented a document, a power of attorney. He announced, with a perfectly straight face, that Arthur's entire estate, the land, the cattle, the legacy, was being immediately liquidated and sold to a commercial mining group. Then Julian turned to me. He pushed a long, heavy wooden box across the table. I opened it. Inside wasn't a deed or a trust or even a letter. It was an old branding iron. Rusted, I bent and snapped clean in half. Wyatt laughed out loud. Victoria looked at me with eyes completely empty of warmth. She told me I could keep it as a souvenir to remember my place in this family. I didn't say a word, keeping my hands buried deep in my pockets so they wouldn't see them shaking. For years, I thought I just wasn't good enough for them to love me. But staring at that piece of junk metal, I finally understood the truth. This wasn't just about the millions of dollars from the mining contract. In a family that feeds on greed and manipulation, the one person who actually cares about the land is a threat. I was the adopted stray, the one who worked the dirt while they played their high society games. I was their mirror. My loyalty only reminded them of how hollow they were inside. Mine handing me that broken iron wasn't just an insult. It was a psychological execution. They were throwing out the only piece of this family that refused to rot along with them. I turned around and walked out into the freezing wind, leaving them behind to celebrate. That same evening, Julian's security escorted me out the front door. The temperature had already dropped below zero, and the Montana wind felt like broken glass against my face. I was given exactly 1 hour to clear out. As I walked through the deep snow toward the old stables, I looked over at the bunkhouse. The lights were off. Dozens of ranch hands, men and women who had given their entire lives to this land, were fast asleep. They had no idea that Julian was going to throw them out into the freezing winter by the end of the week if I packed my bags and disappeared. Knew they would lose everything. I sat down on a hay bale in the darkest corner of the freezing stalls. My breath hung in the air. For a long time, I just stared at the dirt. I felt a heavy, sinking despair. I actually wondered if Arthur had failed us. How could the colonel, a man who always saw 3 steps ahead, leave his legacy so completely unprotected? Then, my mind went back to Victoria. I pictured her standing by the fireplace, her shoulders wrapped in that thick, expensive fur coat, watching me leave without a single blink. For 20 years, I had exhausted myself trying to understand why my sister hated me. I always thought that if I just worked harder, if I never asked for a dime, she would eventually accept me. But sitting there in the freezing dark, a terrifying truth finally hit me. Victoria didn't hate me. She felt absolutely nothing for me. In her world, family wasn't a bond. It was a corporate merger. I wasn't a sister. I was just a failed investment. I chose the mud and the cattle over their fake high society galas. That fur coat she wore was stunning, perfectly tailored, shielding her from the cold, but the woman underneath it was entirely hollow. I pulled my worn jacket tighter around my chest. I realized my eyes were wet, but I wasn't crying over the ranch. I wasn't crying over the money or the fraudulent power of attorney. I was grieving a family that never actually existed. Then, just past midnight, a heavy fist hammered against the barn doors. The wind howled as the heavy wood swung open. A tall figure stepped inside, shaking the snow from his shoulders. It was Elias. He was a retired U.S. Marshal and my father's most trusted friend, until Julian framed him for theft 3 years ago and had him thrown off the ranch. Elias didn't offer any empty sympathy. He walked straight past me, his boots crunching on the frozen dirt, and headed for the back stall where Arthur's oldest saddle was hanging. He pulled a hunting knife from his belt, driving the blade right through the thick leather underbelly. He reached deep into the lining and pulled out 2 things, a weathered leather-bound ledger and a thick envelope bearing a federal seal. He dropped the envelope onto my lap. I stared at the crest stamped into the wax. Elias pulled up a wooden crate, sitting across from me in the freezing cold. He explained exactly how Julian had pulled off his little stunt, and how my father had dug a grave for him before his heart ever gave out. Julian was a contractor. He knew local property laws inside and out. He used a corrupt notary to file that fake power of attorney through the standard civil courts. Julian knew that in a normal civil dispute, he would have total control of the assets while I spent decades bleeding money in legal fees. But Arthur knew exactly who he was dealing with. Elias tapped his weathered fingers against the ledger. He told me that my father didn't use the civil courts at all. 8 weeks before his death, Arthur bypassed the local judges entirely. He executed a sealed filing directly with a federal magistrate. It created an invisible, unbreakable lock on the entire estate. Elias looked me dead in the eyes. He explained that any legal document filed by Julian after that specific date wouldn't just be contested, it would automatically trigger a massive fraud alert with federal banks. Julian thought he was 10 steps ahead when he forged those papers. But the second his pen touched that fake document to sell the land, he didn't secure a multi-million-dollar mining deal. He signed a legally binding confession to federal wire fraud. The greed made them completely blind. They thought they were outsmarting a dying old man. They had no idea they were walking right into a flawless, inescapable legal trap. Elias stood up, gripping the leather ledger tightly. It was filled with every dark transaction Julian had ever made. My father hadn't just protected me. No, he had given Elias the exact weapon he needed to clear his own name and destroy the man who ruined his life. I looked down at the sealed will in my hands. We weren't a helpless family in a civil dispute anymore. We had a federal criminal case, and the hammer was about to drop. By sunrise, the blizzard outside had finally stopped, but the real storm was just hitting the main house. Everything moved with blinding speed. Within 48 hours, black federal vehicles blocked the long, icy driveway. The multi-million-dollar mining contract? Canceled. It was immediately voided by the federal magistrate. Julian's arrogant smirk vanished the second they locked the steel cuffs onto his wrists. I watched from the porch as he was escorted out of the grand front doors, looking small and terrified. He wasn't a master manipulator anymore, just a desperate man facing decades in federal prison for wire fraud. Victoria lost everything. The court formally stripped her of her status as the executor of the estate. The federal freeze hit her offshore accounts, her luxury credit lines, her private trusts. Gone instantly. That expensive fur coat couldn't hide how utterly powerless she looked standing in the snow, watching federal agents box up her entire life. And Wyatt and Mason? The bank seized their brand new sports cars before the week was over. My phone started ringing uncontrollably. First it was Wyatt, then Mason, stuttering and begging for a cash loan. Then came the long, frantic texts from Victoria, suddenly calling me her dear sister, pleading with me to talk to the judge, to show some family loyalty. I just watched the screen light up in the dark. They built their entire existence on greed and the illusion of power. They thought they were completely untouchable. But the moment they tried to crush the one person who actually cared about this land, their entire fake empire collapsed under its own weight. The trap they spent months carefully digging for me was exactly what buried them. Justice didn't come with a screaming match. It came fast, cold, and absolute. Now, the ranch is quiet again. I am sitting by the fire in the main house, holding Arthur's old silver pocket watch. It stopped ticking at the exact hour he passed away. Along with the ledger, Elias had handed me a small sealed letter. The handwriting was shaky but familiar. I broke the seal. "My dearest Clara," it read. "If you are reading this, my worst fear has come true. I'm sorry I left you to face their greed alone. I spent my life building this legacy, but my greatest failure was never teaching my own blood how to be human. They thought I was old and blind to their schemes. But I saw it all. I saw the coldness in Victoria's eyes. I saw Julian's envy. I didn't draft this sealed will to punish them. I did it to protect the only pure thing left in this family. You. This ranch isn't a gift, Clara. It is a shield I forged just for you. Do not feel a single ounce of guilt when you take it all away from them. Fly free, my girl, and never look back." For the first time since he died, I let the tears fall. I wasn't crying because I had won. I was crying out of pure relief. He hadn't abandoned me. He stood right in front of me, shielding me, even after his heart stopped. My phone vibrated on the coffee table. It was Victoria again, leaving another desperate, sobbing voicemail. I didn't answer it. People expect a loud, dramatic revenge. They want you to scream, to insult, to rub it in their faces. But getting angry just proves they still have power over you. The most ruthless punishment you can inflict on toxic people is absolute silence. It is revoking their access to your life. Forever. I picked up the ringing phone and tossed it straight into the burning fireplace. The winter is harsh, but the land is finally mine.